All right, so we just want to welcome everyone to this panel on Indigenous internationalism and solidarities. I'm Michelle Daigle. I am Mushkegowuk, and I am a member of Constance Lake First Nation in Treaty 9. And so today, Wahikea Maile and myself, who will also introduce himself momentarily, we have invited 4 fabulous panelists to be in conversation with one another on the theme of building relationships across Indigenous communities and other racialized anti-colonial communities who are doing work on decolonization and liberation. And so I just wanted to share a little bit about how or what my relationship is to the theme of this panel. My community is in Northern Ontario in so-called Canada. And actually a lot of my thinking on Indigenous solidarities started when I was a graduate student at the University of Washington. And I was the only Indigenous student in my program. And this is where I met one of my collaborators and dear friends, Magie Ramirez, who's now a professor at Simon Fraser University. And she's a Latinx scholar and organizer from the Bay Area. And so during that time, Magie and I really learned from one another and started building a dialogue. And I was learning about the work that she was doing on gentrification and how that was impacting people from Indigenous, Black, and Latinx communities in the Bay Area. And she was also learning more about the impacts of resource extraction and colonial dispossession in Northern Canada. And so we shared a lot, and we, through our work together, we were able to connect with many other wonderful people over the years who are doing work connected to the communities that they come from and have relationships with. And I think more recently for me, I've been thinking about the histories of colonial dispossession and imperialism that are tied to the muskegs where I come from. And so hearing more stories about, for example, Chinese laborers who came onto the shores of the James Bay and who were in relationship with Cree, Anishinaabe, and Oji-Cree peoples in the early 20th century. And also thinking through more recently how we've had increasingly more student refugees coming from the Ivory Coast within Northern Ontario as well. And so thinking about what our responsibilities are as Indigenous people to start building dialogue and relationships with people who are coming onto our homelands and waters. And so I will turn it over now to my colleague, Wahikea.
Aloha kākou, wau Wahikea Maile he kanaka Hawaii au. Aloha everybody, I am Wahikea Maile. I am Kanaka Mauli. I'm from Maunawili on the island Oahu, but my family is also from Hawaii Island and Kauai in the Pai'aina, the Hawaiian archipelago. I am honored to be a colleague, mentor, and instructor of the 2 wonderful, brilliant folks that are here in the recording studio with me physically, and also to learn from new folks and collaborators on this panel and to rekindle relations with those that I have been in the malu of a struggle with in Hawaii. So I wanted to also introduce this panel a little bit by thinking through where we are coming from, where we are located here at the University of Toronto, where we're recording this NAISA North and Dechinta collab panel at the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto St. George campus, the newly formed and established Indigenous Politics Collaboratory. I'm the inaugural director. Both Michelle and Riley, who will introduce herself in a moment, currently work in the Indigenous Politics Collaboratory, and it is a confluence of Indigenous internationalisms in and of itself. It's an international Indigenous politics, policy, and praxis research lab. It's collaborative in a few different types of ways, but first, because of that internationalist approach to Indigenous politics, but also second, in working across the Faculty of Arts and Science here at the University of Toronto, and third, students and faculty working together in research and other projects. Riley is launching a new podcast called Red Surgence, which is going to be recorded edited, produced, and distributed right here in the Indigenous Politics Collaboratory. And I do want to mention that here in Dish with One Spoon Treaty Territory, at the University of Toronto in particular, there's a hydrological and geological convergence that the lab is really interested in exploring as a kind of way to think about Indigenous internationalisms, and that's Tattle Creek. The University of Toronto has submerged to develop itself and erect buildings like the Hart House and create recreational areas at the University of Toronto, like the McCall Pond, by damming Tattle Creek, which is a waterway that has been submerged because of development, like the University of Toronto, Zibing, as it's also known, Anishinaabe. These are existence and ecological relations that continue to rise and show themselves, even though they've been erased in how we at the university or how we in Toronto discuss them as gone in some past. And so I want to bring Zibing into this conversation as a way to think about that confluence of how we all meet today in thinking about this panel, Indigenous Internationalisms. And with that, I would love to hear our panelists, you all, introduce yourselves very briefly before we get started. So Riley, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, Ani. Hello, everybody. Riley, yes, known Indigenous, Yamatong First Nation, Egwa, Toronto, Nudunjaba, Niminweya, Gintash. I just said that my name is Riley. I'm Anishinaabe from Yamatong First Nation, also in Treaty 9 territory. There's some wicked Northern Ontario representation in this booth right now, which I'm into. And I am currently a PhD student at the University of Toronto, and also a writer, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Miigwech.
Mahalo. May, how about you go next?
Sure. Thank you for setting us up and bringing us together, and for opening with making us think about what is submerged and thinking about the confluences in that way and what refuses to go away. So Michelle is an example of what refuses to go away. So Michelle has brought me into conversation with her, I think since 2017, which I've willingly gone to. It's always been consensual, but it's also been a very nurturing and productive space for me to be in conversation. So I thank you all for inviting me. And I've seen some of you at different events and at different speaking events. So I'm pretty honored to be part of this conversation. So I'm calling in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, the Hunkaminam speaking peoples of the Coast Salish territories. My name is May. I'm a queer Filipinx who I work up at Simon Fraser University, and thinking about confluences in the Fraser River, and even just that the colonial name of the Fraser being named after Simon Fraser, and how that cuts through a lot of the places that I'm thinking with and people I'm thinking with, from northern BC down to here, to where the Fraser empties into the Pacific Ocean, which connects to my homelands and my parents' homelands in the Philippines. So thinking about all those places right now, after coming off of, and I'm sure I'll talk about a bit more, but coming off of a sleepless night, trying to tune into the elections in the Philippines, which has brought back a dictator's son to be the president of the Philippines, which gives me chills as I'm sharing that with you today. But I think is thinking about, I love the way you frame this as internationalisms, but thinking about how place converges, not just people, but our colonial legacies and the otherwise worlds that you are asking us to think about, but we have to carry those with us. And I want to try to figure it out with all of you, how to carry those with us in good ways, in ways that will nurture each other. Thank you. I don't know what else. I'll just leave it at that, because I always have this habit of when things are recording, I just keep going. So I'm going to stop.
Mahalo, May. Cyan, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I would like to echo just being so honored to be on this panel, and thank you so much for inviting me. Cian Wilson, based at Wilfrid Laurier University in the community psychology program there. And so for folks who don't know, Laurier is based in Waterloo, which is actually the territory of the Anishinaabe, Neutral, and Haudenosaunee people on the Grand River Basin in the Dish with One Spoon Treaty territory. And so, just by extension, a larger, consider it now the extension of the GTA, because I feel like the GTA just keeps getting bigger and bigger and expanding across Southern Ontario is how I feel. Toronto is sort of culturally as well as economically, just all of the things that are tied to that economic hub of Canada. Really, I'm super excited to engage in this conversation around Indigenous internationalisms. I work predominantly with Indigenous and Black communities in a lot of my work, and so super excited to think through some of these things with you as someone who's actually from the Caribbean. So I'm from Jamaica. Of Afro ancestry, as well as Indo-Jamaican ancestry and Euro-Jamaican ancestry. So all kinds of mixed mosh, as we know that is the way in which colonization has functioned in the Western society, where it's been sort of like a site of creolization, and creolization is really the byproduct of violence, as we know. And so just thinking through all of those things with all of you today. So I'm really excited to engage in these conversations and looking forward.
Mahalo, Cian. Kaneli, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah. Aloha mai kako, o Kaneli Kanaka Maoli wau. My name is Kaneli. I am also a Kanaka Maoli like Wahikea. My genealogical ties primarily go back to Hawaii Island, Maui, which is where a lot of the things I'll be sharing today. My work is more recently is focused on Maui, and as well as Kauai, where I'm currently at, visiting Ohana and continuing to learn from my Ohana here and what the work they've been doing and how trying to just think through a lot of inter-island organizing work. Yeah, mahalo for having me.
Thank you everyone for those introductions. And I also want to thank Wahikea for reminding us about Zabing and Zabing's role in kind of framing our conversations today about Indigenous internationalism. That's something that really resonates with me, being from Treaty 9 and thinking about the role that the Albany and Attawapiskat rivers play in building relationships within that region. And I know that I've also learned a lot from Kanaka Maoli scholars as well in terms of the role of water and building relationships and solidarities across the oceanic region. And so, Cian, hopefully we can host you here in person someday. You're not too far in Waterloo, and hopefully we can also get May and Kane'ali'i out here as well for a visit at some point as well. Okay, so we are going to get into our questions, and the first question is really intended to get to know each other a little bit better so that we can learn more about your work. So please feel free to take some time to really kind of delve into this question. And so we'd like to hear about the kinds of community practices, organizing, and research each of you are working on, and specifically how solidarity and relationship building figures into your work. And so maybe we can start with May, if that sounds good.
Of course, I was thinking to myself, oh, I hope she doesn't call my name, but that's what always happens when you think that. But no, thanks for that question. So I'm currently working on a project, a research project with Filipinos or Filipinxs who live on the unceded territories of the Lheidli peoples, which is the territories where the largest urban center in northern BC is at, which is so-called Prince George. And that's also very much a place of confluence where two rivers meet, but also a lot of Indigenous communities from surrounding territories also meet. And also in the case of the people I'm working with, recently arrived immigrants or racialized immigrants. So the project that we're doing up there is looking at how the labor that Filipinxs perform in the northern extractive resource economies of the northern landscape, and thinking through how Filipinos go there to work, but what are those relationships or implications with Indigenous questions of sovereignty and dispossession. And so how can we think of those two seemingly disparate topics or organizing principles of our lives together, right? How do we think of them together in the contemporary moment? So with resource extractive industries and really ramping up in northern British Columbia and so-called northern British Columbia, and labor being brought in from different parts of not just Canada, but the world. What kinds of labor are Filipinxs performing? And what does, how can we see ourselves in relation? So relationship building for me, I think has always been part of what I try to do or what I try to bring, because that question of what it means to be Filipino, Filipinx, who is either forced to leave their homelands and their families because of structural conditions, or who decided to because of limited life opportunities. How do we make sense of that migration, displacement migration when we're on stolen territories? So that question really came while I was living and working here on Coast Salish territories and working with Filipinos who are thinking through that question, who are doing organizing work, research work, and political work around that question. And of course, in relationship with the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples whose legal orders and relationships to their lands and other than humans and themselves is something that we've entered, and something that we brought us to question, what does it mean for us to be on unceded territories? So that question has kind of always been, since I joined academia, part of my work, but also has informed a lot of the community work that me and my family have been doing. And I brought that with me when I worked while doing my project with Filipinos in Prince George. And of course, it's not like they weren't thinking about that themselves, but it's so different when you're talking about a place that's very much organized around a white settler and an Indigenous binary, where racialized immigrants really struggle to just not only survive, but to figure out their place, right? So that's one of the things that I think is in sharper relief in a place like Prince George. And it was in Prince George when I was in conversation with a Lheidli T'enneh elder, Darlene McIntosh, who I was talking with very, very early on in the process about my project and what I was hoping to do. She simply, after this long conversation at the end, simply told me, oh, you have a lot of work to do. And by that, I took that to mean a lot of work to do within my community, so among Filipinos. And so now it's about, in conversation and relationship with Filipinos up there, is what is that work? What is that work, and how do we go about doing that? And that's where we're at now, is defining for ourselves what that work is. And that's something I'm happy to talk about later and think through with you all later, is how do we start where people are at, and the conditions that people are given, and how to do that in ways that are both sharp, like they can get at the contradictions that make Canada, but also can build community and build community across difference. So that's kind of what I think about relationship building, is that's kind of the key of, I think, of what we have to be doing. I can't imagine because people do it every day in the university, right? Doing research without relationships, but yeah, I think people would rightly so, call me in or call me out. Thank you.
Thanks so much, May. And I always really appreciate, the level of humility that you bring to these conversations, and how you always kind of remind folks that we need to start where people are at, and how you've articulated that in different spaces that I've shared with you, and what that looks like. in some of the community spaces and conversations that you've had. And also thinking through the interconnections of Spanish and American imperialism in the Philippines and how that's connected to colonization here in Canada. But I think also you've reflected in some moments about like what it means to be a good guest when you're somewhere through your own kind of teachings and language. And so that always kind of deeply resonates with me as well. So thank you for sharing. Okay, so now I think I will go over to Kane Ali'i, if that sounds good.
So for me, some of the work that we've been doing, that I've been involved in on Maui has really been focused on very, very traditional understandings of our family structures in relation to how our land is managed. So we have what are called kuleana lands, which are lands that were originally belonged to the ali'i, or the crown of the Hawaiian Kingdom government. But in the 1850s, around that time, a lot of that land was distributed because of the influx of really early American imperialism and plantations, missionaries, that eventually led up to what would become the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom government by those same entities. But those land titles that are kuleana lands were a very early way for to distribute the lands within very different families that would have that forever through legal paperwork. What we struggle with here, of course, is generations of denationalization and deculturalization, including many of our families not knowing our genealogies and our genealogical claims back to those very land titles that are solidified in, state archives, the Bureau of Conveyance, all these agencies here in Hawaii. And so part of the organizing is remembering, one, our ohana family structures, which is very much situated what's called an ahupua'a, which is a mountain to sea land division. And all those people that traditionally lived in that one ahupua'a were all families, closely related families. And then those ahupua'a expand into what are called moku, or districts, and then eventually into the mokupuni, of the island. And so we're really very much still centering that same structure of understanding ourselves here as a way to support each other in our own processes. Because we're all, as far as our kuleana lands are concerned, we all have, we have the same struggle, but everyone is slightly different because of who exactly is the corporation or whatever other entity that fraudulently claimed our lands. And on top of that, our water. For me, my family, we just got back to our lands and started reclaiming it a year ago. Actually on the 6th of this month, that made 1 year. And we've been dealing with a few corporations that I'll be explaining more in depth later visually. But one of them is Alexander and Baldwin, which initially was one of the early plantations that was involved in the overthrow. And then transitioned into the real estate company that then own a lot of the lands, or claim they own a lot of our lands, many of which are fraudulently done, as is the case with my family's land. As well, as far as the water is concerned, we're also dealing with agricultural farm company called Mahipono that claims that it's here on Maui doing sustainable agricultural work for providing us jobs, providing us local food, at the expense really of stealing our water from East Maui, which is where my family's land is also located, with a bunch of other families' lands. And so I'm not the first to be involved in this. There's been generations and generations of families that have been fighting against these two corporations that own East Maui Irrigation, which is the water company. Luckily, I've been able to, within the past year, I think, make a lot of groundwork. I think that's amplified some of the other families, but I've also been learning from the other families as well that have been involved, that have generational knowledge of the laws, of different tactics and strategies that they've used against these companies, as well as their own networks for helping and supporting those of us who are new, just now returning back to our lands, returning our families back to our lands, providing us resources, supporting us through what really is having to reoccupy land that for many generations hasn't had our family on them because they were pushed off because of our water being stolen during the 1800s by these plantations. Even now, there's other families I've learned from on the west side of the island of Maui that taught me how to do genealogy research, how to find the land titles, how to, even defend ourselves against the police that are called on us when we return to our land and there's, a settler that either is claiming our land or is working on behalf of the corporations that are calling the police on us to remove us from our own land that we have the genealogical claim and the paperwork to prove it. Those are all things that we've had to learn how to negotiate, how to navigate living under a military occupation, while still having to make sure that we don't lose ourselves. And we're constantly up against even other people trying to tell us as the genealogical descendants that our families don't even exist, even though our names are literally on paper to prove those things. So that's kind of what I've been involved with over the past year. And through my own work, learning how to live sustainably off-grid, I've been able to, I took actually, prior to me returning to my family's land, I was learning from on the ground with other families and learning how to grow our own food, how to live off the grid, how to, catch our own rainwater when our water is being diverted. And for the families that, haven't lived that lifestyle for a long time and have lived more of an American lifestyle within Hawaii, because that's what they've been taught for several generations, then teaching them those same techniques and strategies and lifestyles to help them transition back to their land, rather than having to pay an arm and a leg just to survive rent here in our own homeland. Those are just some of the things, but I'll share more later on. So.
Mahalo Kanei'li'i. And for some of the viewers and the audience members that are listening to this panel, you might be wondering, how does this impact Canada? Well, one of the two main partners in this corporation that Kanei'li'i is battling and other Kuleana land owners and farmers in Hawaii are battling is the CPP, Canadian Pension Plan, which an article in The Breach, an independent Canadian news outlet, recently investigated that CPP, Canadian Pension Plan, is investing in this corporation on Maui, which is enacting all sorts of violence to Kanaka Maoli and to the archipelago of Hawaii, to water, to land, to the crops, to our ways of being and knowing. Investing in this company on behalf of certain stakeholders, and those are military personnel and RCMP. So Canada is profiting off of the struggles of Kanaka Maoli in Hawaii. And Kanei'li'i is on the front line of that struggle. So we'll talk more about that later. But I'd love to turn this question to Riley and hear from Riley on this question next.
Yeah, for sure. I'm having so many good notes already. This is like, I opened up the notepad on your computer, Waiakea, and it's just going to be full. So I figured I started thinking about this like in terms of my research and then like in terms of my everyday practice of like, what does solidarity and internationalism look like and figure in, but like they're so closely related. to give a little bit of backstory, like, so I am a very junior scholar. I just am finishing now my first year of the PhD program, where I came like right from my undergrad. So my time in the academy has been very brief. And the only reason I chose to come to the program was because outside of the academy, I had spent like the time since I was probably 15 years old, a really young teenager. Like I got like thrust into these national political spaces, and quickly became like really disillusioned and realized I had a really horrible romantic version of what politics was and what change making had to look like and all these things. And so I left, and it was like Indigenous folks, not only in Canada, but all over the world, who like took me in and spent like years sharing their knowledge with me and talking to me about the importance of solidarity. And they like really laid the foundation and the bedrock for all of like my knowledge and my study. And so I see like coming back to the academy as like a way of just like hopefully giving myself some space and time to think about all those things and like document them in a way that I might not otherwise have the space to. So that work is now that I'm focusing on, like, I guess will inform my thesis at some point, is about land back, and also just Indigenous resurgent movements more generally, and like specifically the role that young people play in them. And so like one of the first things I did when I started thinking about land back was like, you know, where did this idea come from? And then you get stuck down this like really long rabbit hole of Indigenous resurgence, which when you do that work realize is also like deeply connected to intercommunity and internation solidarities. It was actually in Michelle's class, we talked about the Red Power movement and its relation to the Black Panthers. I think we talked about this briefly in Waika's class too. And so you just see, and connections to Palestine and organizing in Latin America and, you know, just everywhere. And even within, you know, territories now known as Canada, but like, you know, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy as being an example of internationalisms, as the Blackfoot Confederacy as being an internationalism. And so, and the resistance that they all did, and like the diplomacy that all happened there. And so it was like, you know, the whole past of everything that I think led to land back is just inextricably tied to solidarity and to internationalism. And then the thing that I'm thinking a lot about these days now, as I'm thinking a little bit forward, are okay, so like getting the land back is for a purpose, right? Like it's, for me, I see it as like a means to like building so that we have the capacity, the authority, all those things that we need to build those futures that were so interrupted by colonization. And how other folks, Black and Asian and Latin and every other, oppressed, marginalized, all our kin fits into that is not an afterthought. It's not like, and then once we reach those worlds, then we'll figure out what to do with everybody else. It's no, like they have to be an active part of that process of building and envisioning. And so that's something that I think about a lot in terms of when I think about, okay, what is land back for? What are we land back building to? And so this bleeds into sort of interpersonal reactions outside of just my research nowadays. And when I was thinking about how exactly that happens, I started to think back to like my earliest years when I was, doing advocacy or activism work. And so much of it was geared towards like educating non-Indigenous, specifically white people, on like how to not be terrible, like, to put it simply, right? And I was like, and it was so exhausting, and it was so energy draining. And I realized that I only had like a finite amount of resources in me to be able to like put into the world around me. And I would much rather that be going in back to our own communities, back into solidarity building. And so I spend like, way more time these days looking at like, how do our own communities need to be better for us to be better kin and to be better relatives, understanding that like, our solidarities are how we get to that future, that our liberations are tied, that we cannot be free until we are all free. And so like part of that has been for me recently looking really critically at the anti-Blackness within Indigenous communities. I spend a lot of time thinking about how also as like a white Native person, how is my power and my relationship to Black folks and Black Indigenous folks? What am I doing to recognize that and about that? And so that's where like, all that energy I like to think that I was spending on being like, hey, maybe Canada is kind of evil. Don't you think that like now I get to spend with, our own people and actively practicing those futures that I want to build. And so that's been a really revolutionary change for me in the last few years or so.
Thanks so much, Thanks so much, Riley, for sharing that. And and thank you for kind of reminding me of that space that we were able to share, even though it was virtually last year. I think we had a lot of really good conversations about Indigenous relationship building, and I really appreciated your generosity within those conversations as well. And I think also what I've been thinking about more recently is, when we talk about relationship building across Indigenous and Black communities, for example, that we also need to think about how people embody, both of those genealogies, themselves within their families. And I know that, Cian, that's been a big part of your work as well. And so I'm going to hand it over to you so that we can learn a little bit more about the work that you've been doing.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Yeah, I want to, like, so many amazing conversations already. I just want to, bottle this all up. It's like amazing. I was thinking as folks were talking around, even policing and how, in the United States, for example, policing, the first police were actually called I think they were called the slave patrols. And they were there to literally patrol enslaved Black people, right? And make sure that they were dragged back to their plantations and their masters. Here in Canada, the RCMP, or the earlier version of the RCMP, was literally put in power to annex Indigenous peoples from their territories. So Kanai, and I'm messing up your name, I'm butchering your name here, I'm so sorry about that. When you were talking about that, the modern manifestation, like what you're dealing with in your own family, in your own community, this is the continuation of that. And what was mentioned around the CPP, I also think about the fact that Canada literally runs a lot of the mines in continental Africa currently. And if folks are not aware, Canada also has a hand in the Canadian mine that literally has 8 Indigenous men in Burkina Faso who are underground, stuck in a mine while they figure out legalities and whether or not they're actually going to try to save these men's lives. And so when we think about, when I think about internationality and indigeneity, I think about the ways in which colonization was a global project, was a very thorough project. And literally what we have is a colonial project that literally repeated itself time and time and time again, place to place to place, in perfecting itself, in perfecting torture. So whether we're thinking about, reserves in South Africa or reserves right here in North America, these are very similar things. When I see images of the Marshall Islands, I see images of like literally like replications of the Caribbean, right? So the fact that colonization was such a thorough project in replicating what it looks like, even the way that our children dress to go to school, the berets they wear in their heads, the things that we wear to church, even the fact that I can go to Australia and be mistaken for Indigenous Australian, the ways in which our communities have literally been, shattered, and creolization being a result of that. All of these things are really, really, really related. And so to your point, Riley, my dissertation was actually based on solidarity building between Indigenous and Black communities, where I looked at the ways in which our communities have historically and contemporarily continue to deal with the same sorts of colonial violence, and the ways in which we've had to band together to survive. So in Canada, for example, a lot of folks don't know this, but folks who came up through the Underground Railroad, enslaved Black people, often married Indigenous people for survival as a method of survival. And often that was to ensure that their kids wouldn't go to residential schools, for example, in the East Coast, and were protected. So, Indigenous people would marry and procreate with Black folks as a form of survival, literally survival, as an example. And that spread throughout the Eastern Seaboard. I work with a lot of as Michelle was alluding to, mixed Indigenous and Black communities that have over 500 years of history of working together, of surviving together. And one of my projects, the Proclaiming Our Roots project, really sheds lights on the stories and the histories and the communities of Indigenous Black people. And I find it such a strange thing because Indigenous people in almost everywhere else in the world are dark-skinned, deeply melanated people. So I feel like it's kind of this weird thing where it's like I have to preface and categorize that in the North American context because that's not always the case. But in every other part of the world, Indigenous people are actually melanated people and often, identify as Black, as we know with the Polynesian Panthers, for example, who were identifying as Black, and a lot of Indigenous Australian folks still do identify as Black. And so really thinking about these things, both historically and contemporarily, and the ways in which, anti-colonial movements are so deeply connected internationally for me it's always a trip sometimes to remind myself, oh yeah, I'm in North America where I've got to qualify and categorize these things. And explain, because these things are not always the same thing. So in terms of some of the ways in which I engage in solidarity work, I do a lot of arts-based practice. So engaging with storytelling and prioritizing and centering our stories as Indigenous and Black people. So digital storytelling being one of those, so personal video making where people tell their stories, bring in images and music and things that are cultural artifacts for themselves or significant artifacts from their families. Another way that I engage, in solidarity building practice is through coalition building. So coalition building masked as research, which is really dope, and I encourage it for everyone. We're actually working on one such sort of coalition esque kind of project where it's about challenging research ethics and the research processes and the ways in which increasingly in the digital age, informed consent has gone out the window, right? And so, principles like the OCAP principles, or if you go to other parts of the world, Indigenous created principles and policies are being infringed on slowly but surely through things like social media and, search engines and so on and so forth, where data is being gathered from us and bought and sold at prices and stock values higher than oil, the price of oil. Like whether we know this, in 2021, actually data outpriced oil. So we're literally, being bought and sold without our consent and knowledge as we speak, and how that infringes. And this project in particular, alongside my co-director, Lana James, looks at how that infringes on Indigenous and community created protocols to protect sovereignty and self-determination and all of these things that we value. So those are some of the ways. So arts-based work for sure, coalition building as research, which I think is super important, kinds of work. And for me, another type of approach that I always take is also, uprooting our histories of doing this work throughout time, which is always mind-blowing to find out the ways in which, as you so articulately mentioned, Riley, the ways that we've inspired each other throughout history, which is always important to know that while we may sometimes feel the pressure and the overwhelm of this work in the contemporary moment, that our foreparents also were engaging in these battles together, and that's always inspiring. So those are just some of the ways that I think about this work.
All for that, Cian. There's so much to say about what you've just brought into the panel and connections to what other folks are working on. I have my own thoughts about my research, how it connects to everyone. But instead of saying something that I want to ask a question and open it up to you all instead. So what are some of the practices then and methodologies that you center in your work, whether it's community organizing or research and community organizing that specifically work to cultivate relationship building? Some of you have mentioned this in your initial comments, but we're wondering if you could talk more about the methodologies and practices that help to enable that relationship building. Anyone can address this. May, let's turn it over to you. I'd love to hear what you think.
Oh, yeah, I was thinking about this when I was reviewing the questions, and what the first word that came to my mind was time. It takes time, right? Like, and face to face, and this everything that COVID is showing us that we never had in the first place, or that COVID's only exposed some of those conditions that have make it hard for us to do the work that you've all been describing, which I think is amazing. Yeah, time and the things that we've done is trying to make dedicated time and space for our community to talk within our circles, so that we can ask ourselves the difficult questions that some, especially newly arrived immigrants, are afraid to ask, or don't even have the time to ask. And I've been told that that I have the privilege, and I completely recognize that, to think about these questions and to think about, like what Michelle was talking about, being a good guest, or how to dismantle, anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity in the Filipino community, where people just don't have that time. So it's about making that space, providing the resources as much as we can, of course. And I think for many of us, it's centered around food and family and conversation and music. And just talking about different ways of talking. I was thinking about an event we had in Prince George, organized by Filipinx youth. And this is the first event that they had put on as a community. And it was centered around the concept of harana, which is, of course, a Spanish concept, but it's about love, and it's about love through expression of music. But we try to dismantle kind of love in the sense of just romantic love. Of course, there was tinges of that, but love, imagining love in different ways, in a space where they were able to perform their poetry and their music, and just talking about, what stories we're bringing into the room and what questions we might have around thinking about love differently. So I think it's that, and we've had what we call kamayans. Kamay means hands, and kamayan means to use your hands, and to use your hands to eat. To use your hands to eat together on banana leaves. We've tried to replicate that as much as we can in an urban setting with no banana trees. But using that to just bring us together to ask each other these questions, and to talk about many of the things that you've all been sharing. And I think one of the things that I want to do more of is that intergenerational conversation, because there's this perception that our parents or people before us have come to Canada without any histories of political activism, when that's not the case. There's so many people in our community that still carry anti-colonial sentiment, but were involved in fighting the Marcos dictatorship. Ancestors were involved in fighting Japanese occupation, the American War, and all those things. Like, there's a lot that we can learn, and also intergenerational in the sense of people who are organizing before myself, even, who were making connections with the Red Power movement, the Third World national liberation struggles in these urban centers with Black, Indigenous, and Palestinian, Latinx peoples, who are thinking already about these connections. As many of you have pointed out, the genealogies that we've come from. And I think what stops is that storytelling because of this question of time. How do we take that away from capitalist and colonial modes of extraction, but make that about us? And I really, really appreciate that everybody's been talking about that, right? How do we talk with ourselves and among ourselves, and forget whiteness, even though we have to deal with it. But it's such a prevalent, though, that aspiration towards whiteness is so prevalent in the migrant Filipinx immigrant community. And, you know, there's reasons for that, but it's something that we need to figure out how to dismantle. So those are just some of the examples of some of the few things that we've done together. But I love what Sian was talking about, the digital storytelling and the other ways that we can do that. So yeah, thank you all.
Mahalo, May. Sian, since May just mentioned your work, why don't we hear from you next?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to build off what I had mentioned, I do work with arts and digital media quite a bit. One, because, intergenerationally, I've actually found people that some of these modalities are actually really easy and intuitive to work with. So whether it's a tablet or some of these things, and you may think, oh man, like elders may not gravitate to that, but let me tell you, in some of these digital storytelling workshops, the elders finish first. I've also found it really, really effective to tell stories through videos and sound and music and all of these different things that people want to bring into their stories, as it crosses language barriers too. So folks who might struggle with English language or may not know how to read or write have really excelled in these modalities. And so I really value them for the ways in which they bring people in, and people enter at the point of sort of the story that they want to tell in that particular moment and time. And so, for me, digital storytelling, arts-based methods, photo voice is another one that I've worked with. And there are many others. There's poetry. There's so many different types. And I've also had the sort of like privilege of working with Sarah Flicker, who was my PhD supervisor and my master's supervisor, and she's worked with many different methods. So we've worked with hip hop through Sarah, or mural making is another one, or just so many different kinds of arts-based modalities that we've worked with over the years to engage communities in accessible ways, to talk about sometimes really difficult, tough topics like colonization, like sexual violence, like all of these things, like all of the things that are really challenging for us to sort of get through. Art can be a modality for engagement, and it definitely comes with its challenges. So don't get me wrong, there's lots of critiques about arts-based research as well. But I found that it definitely helps to transcend some of the language and boundaries and intergenerational boundaries that might exist in the communities that we're working with. As I mentioned, coalition building being another one. I'm such an advocate for coalition building as research. And for me, a huge part of that kind of an approach is to get together around projects that people are really passionate about. So in this project that I was mentioning, where literally the objective is to look at the wise and best practices of protocols, Indigenous created protocols the world over, from around the globe, and to look at what can we take from those and sort of impacting policies around research ethics here in Canada. It's something that brings international partners in that are really interested in this work, that are doing this work in their own places, but don't have the capacity or the resources to do this on their own. It builds relationships just in terms of those, the commonalities and the excitement that builds. I also think it's not a methodology, but I would say it's a practice. It's a part of our practice is humility, like knowing that you don't know everything. And admitting that and being okay with that. And also knowing that you're learning, that you're learning actually a lot more than maybe your community partners are, or even your elders in the process are, or, your students even sometimes, like you're learning a lot. So humility goes a really long way in terms of this work and in terms of in an effort to build meaningful relationships, right? To listen to what your partners and what everyone at the table is needing from a process. And accommodating that immediately. So I think humility goes a long way. It's not really a methodology, but I think it's such an important part of meaningful relationship building, which is so pivotal to this work. And I'm going to pull from, scholar Sean Wilson, who talks about an Indigenous research paradigm and research as ceremony, and talk about relationality, and the importance of that relationality is because in it is built accountability, right? Like we're all accountable to each other and in this process. And if we feel accountable to each other and responsible and respectful to each other, it's a heck of a lot less likely that we're going to, do something that is disrespectful or disregarding of the all of the members of the team. And so these are just some of the sort of approaches that I take to this work that I think is so pivotal, to a good process and proceeding with research that is beneficial as well to our communities, and mutually beneficial all around. So that's just some of the things that I think about in terms of approaches, not necessarily methodologies, which was like the arts-based stuff and, coalition and all of these other pieces, but certainly I think are as important, in my opinion, as the process is the framing that you enter these spaces with.
This is an amazing conversation. We're just going to keep snaking around, hearing from the other folks that haven't talked yet. And I'm thinking about food in the practice of relationship building. I'm thinking also about digital storytelling in the practice of relationship building. And I'm thinking of you, Kaneali'i. You are on the Aina, the land as it's known in Aloha Hawaii, but also that who feeds, that which feeds. You are mahiai, farming that land, your kuleana land, and you're also fighting water privatization and corporate forms of colonialism in occupied Hawaii. What do you think about this question? What are some of the practices that you center in this work to cultivate relationships?
So I would say the main practice is really the genealogy research is the community organizing itself. I always like to think that as Kanaka here in Hawaii, like we're all related. We live on, an isolated island. That's where our ancestors come from. We're all one ohana, and really it comes down to just learning how are we related. And it's in that process of learning how we're related that we're actively building our relationship. And so for those families that have either been on the land, on their kuleana lands, or are returning to their lands and in the process of still fighting whatever entity they're fighting, we're actively farming at the same time. And in our own ways of farming, the more food that we're able to produce from our own land, that to us culturally is our understanding of what wealth is. And so once we have that wealth, we then redistribute it to the families that don't have that wealth yet, as a way to inspire them that they too can have that. It builds our relationship with them, and then it gives them an image of what their lives can become as they learn about their genealogies too, back to their Aina or their kuleana lands. For me, I've also, because my master's background is, I did my master's in business administration, which is interesting because I actually came from an undergraduate in ethnic studies. And I jumped ship mainly because I wanted to learn the ins and outs of corporate structure, and then weaponize it against the very entities that are really controlling our land and water here. And so combining that inside knowledge along with some of the skills I learned from my own mother, doing investigative research, in her background, like things like how to document in video, document everything in video, when communicating with particular entities, whether it's the corporation itself, whether it's a state agency, or what have you, everything in writing, because then that becomes our tools against them, to catch them in their own lies, to catch them, and also to protect ourselves as well at the same time. Those are things that a lot of families here don't have the tools yet, or haven't had that practice of doing those things. And so in my work, I get to teach them how to do those type of strategies, how to protect themselves, and really to help sustain their reoccupation of their kuleana lands and their family lands. There's one family that actually took me in very early on. We have a process called hanai, which is it's not necessarily the same as adoption in the legal sense, but it's a similar concept, and they took me in as one of their own, and in that process I learned directly from them, firsthand on the ground. And then with that knowledge, I was able to move to another family that took me in and share those same methods that they use for their space, and then spread it. Where it's really about sharing knowledge, and not withholding that knowledge, because as I mentioned earlier, like a lot of our families, as far as genealogy research is concerned, a lot of our families don't even know their genealogies far back enough to these land titles. And so they don't know the ins and outs of, you know, how to do genealogy research, what is, where to find certain kinds of documents, how to navigate different websites. And that's where especially the older generations that don't know how to, you know, go onto a laptop or might not know a lot of Hawaii, for example, don't know how to speak our native language, and our documents are written in Hawaiian language. There's a language barrier that was created through the occupation. And so that's where those of us who have had the opportunity to learn these things step in and assist them in their process as well. There's been a lot of examples where like our family names that we carry as last names were actually the original name of an ancestor of ours that got those land titles. Those are things people don't know. Or different variation spellings of names that are the same person, and there's linking documents to find that piece those puzzles together. Those are all things that a lot of our families don't know. And so that's when I say knowledge, like sharing knowledge, that's what's really important for us, is not to keep that to ourselves, but to spread it. And then, you know, it's sort of like a virus that spreads, and we as Kanaka Maoris begin to return to our lands. I'm diasporic. I was born and raised outside of the islands myself. I'm a first generation diaspora. Well, technically my mom is, because she was the first to leave. She was born and raised in the islands. And so my own experience returning home, I get to inspire other Kanakas who have that same experience to come back to our homeland. More than, you know, half of our people are not even in the islands because of displacement, various kinds of displacement that really all go back to the occupation, our lands constantly being stolen from us. But despite all that history, we still have the opportunity to create a space of hope and inspiration for others to see and desire that ancestral desire to want to be Kanaka Maoli again, and really to fight the cultural suppression that we face because of American imperialism, really. But yeah, I think that's what I can share for now.
Halakaneli, speaking back to power is not just a negative process. It is also a positive, affirming, life-giving, life cultivating, life sharing, and relationship building process. And I know this is a core element of Riley's new podcast, Redsurgence. And so I'd love to hear from Riley about this question, you know, methodologies, practices that you center in your work, organizing and research to cultivate these relationships and building these relationships.
Yeah, that was a perfect transition to exactly what I was thinking. Because I've been thinking a lot along, I think the same lines as May was discussing about like having like love and joy as the foundations of like any like theoretical work and then also practice that I'm doing. I found like, you know, as I would have been studying that there's a lot of writing, really powerful writing about like the power of rage and resentment and anger and indignance. Like I'm thinking of Glenn Coulthard and Daniel Voth and like all these people who have like taken, and I think very powerfully because they're often terms also like weaponized against oppressed people to be like markers of our incivility, right? Like, oh, like you, are always angry, the barbarism, all those things. And so I think that there's like a real distinct power in that way too, that it's reclaiming something. But I have been, I really think that like the problem with it, or where I get like really tense, is that like rage to me is often like the bubble over. I'm interested in like the boil that's like going most of the time otherwise. And I think that that's the love, right? And like Bell Hooks, for example, talks about this all the time when like she would say, that like it is our love firstly that makes us intolerant of injustice. And so you know, I think that rage is the part that we tie back to, like, when, oh, we got so mad that, you know, this corporation or this government or this whatever did this, that we all went out, and they become these iconic moments that we tie it ultimately back to rage, when in fact, like, I think if you looked a little bit deeper, there would always be that love there. And so, like, I'm really concentrated on, like, yeah, even seeing how our most angry, our most resentful we can be is actually also ultimately this form of love. And that is, like, all of that thinking, as I've sort of alluded to, is, like, really rooted in Black feminist thought, especially. And so that I pay homage to those thinkers who really put that in me. In terms of, like, also just practices I'm of relationship building I'm really interested in, and of, like, resurgence are, you know, I'm really trying to read more about, like, mutual aid and economies of care, and how, you know, we as people in solidarity with one another can support each other outside of state institutions, outside of systems where we might have to make compromises, and instead, like, are able to put things in each other's hands in a way that, like, becomes our currency. I think that that's, like, a really cool thing. And I'm also thinking a lot about what relationship building in the digital age looks like. And I think it's because, like, in the social movement literature, especially, there's so much talk about, like, how awesome it was for, you know, increasing the accessibility of movements. People could join and share, thereby lifting up the movement without actually having to be part of, like, you know, an organization that might be elitist or exclusionary. And, like, it made being part of these relationships to mobilization much broader. But at the same time, like, Leanne Simpson, in conversation with, I think, Ronaldo Walcott and Glenn Coulthard, talks about how, you know, it also, when she's reflecting back on Idle No More, that the internet she sees much more as a deterrent because of the way that all of the relationships were so superficial, and they were all behind keyboards, and they contributed ultimately to these fickle solidarities, so that when there was disputes, they blew up in ways that, you know, if people were rooted in this place of real relationship and care, that she doesn't think they would have. And so recognizing, like, that there's both good and bad that comes with that, like, what is the best practice then? Understanding that the internet is an inevitability in our relationships going forward. Like, how can we learn from both the best that it offers us, while also being consciously wary of all of the potential drawbacks it has, and creating a framework that can help us to do that in you know, the best way, is something I'm thinking a lot about. And I don't have it all mapped out perfectly yet, but I think is something that's going to be really, really important, especially going forward.
Thanks so much for that, Riley. The last part that you were sharing about the digital space and the complexities of that and relationship building, it really reminds me of the work of Jason Lewis, who Wahike and I were actually just discussing his work before this panel conversation. And I've just been learning a little bit more about all of the work that he's done on digital media and artificial intelligence, and how he brings people from different Indigenous communities together, including people from Kanaka Maoli communities together, to think about how we can shape the digital space according to Indigenous knowledge and what he calls, I believe, Indigenous kinship protocols. So yeah, you might want to check out his work. But also, you know, as you were speaking, I was thinking a lot about what, you know, some common themes that have come up throughout our conversation around, you know, the need for time, the need to be with people, to share food, to share music, to be present with one another. And also what you shared about, like, rage also being you know, also that we need to understand that as being an indication of the love that we all have as well for one another, for our relations, and how that connects with what May was also sharing in terms of how we need to kind of reconceptualize love beyond the romantic love, which is something that an elder from Treaty 3, an Anishinaabe elder, shared with me several years ago too. So anyways, just trying to kind of bring all of those connections together. But We do have one more question, and I know that we've been speaking for about an hour, so I was thinking that maybe we can kind of bring our dialogue to a close, and maybe everyone can take a couple of minutes to share some reflections on how solidarity building on the local and or global scales offers, or what solidarity building offers us in terms of envisioning worlds otherwise. And we know that this is a big question. We're not going to answer it today, nor should we, but I think it gives us the opportunity to finish off by really centering our desires, our visions, and the importance in dreaming as well, right? In building these dialogues and relationships as well. So I'm going to leave it open. And if anyone wants to lead in these closing remarks, I will leave it up to you.
I'll pipe in because I was just thinking about some of what Riley was just saying about digital solidarity building, and so much of this factors into this, the work that I do on ethics with my team, where and maybe this is just like a Black thing, like maybe maybe I think this way because there's always a fear within Black community about surveillance, and in the digital age, there is so much potential for surveillance, right? Like everything is archived, documented, saved somewhere, stored somewhere. And if you're using a particular search engine, it's, like this is all data, right? Like this is all data that the folks profit from keeping, storing, selling, even this conversation on Zoom, right? Beyond the uses that we've consented to collectively here, it could potentially be used by the people who create Zoom. And so just all of the things I think about always with the digitization of our interactions is surveillance. That's an ever-present sort of like fear and concern, and especially being a Black embodied person in this particular context where surveillance is really real. Like in Waterloo, very white sort of town, predominantly white. It is the home of the Proud Boys. It is the home, there's, all kinds of white supremacy across Southern Ontario. And so, really thinking about surveillance in a very real way and how the digitization of our relationships and solidarity and movement building, while so many infinite possibilities are made possible through this digital world, there's also this really sort of shady, messed up downside that for Black and Brown folks is an ever-present sort of concern. And I just sort of would like to name that as sort of like, okay, so as I think about, what are the possibilities and looking forward on a global scale, I mean, I do think that the digital world provides us a lot of opportunities for connecting issues, as we've done in this conversation, connecting what's going on in the Philippines or Burkina Faso to what's going on in Hawaii and Canada. And for me, when I think about like, what does that future look like in doing this work for as long as I have, one of the things that I've really struggled with is, again, this separation of what's going on with Indigenous communities internationally and what's going on here in Canada. It's been a struggle because I see a lot of connections. I see this as all anti-colonial work of trying to disentangle ourselves from the violence that is the ongoing colonization. And I think that we do ourselves kind of a disservice when as Black and Brown folks the world over, we try to separate out what we're doing as somehow unique and separate from what other folks are doing elsewhere. And I understand at the same time the necessity to do that sometimes, because sometimes as Indigenous peoples, especially in Canada, there has to be a space where you carve out to say, no, we're not just equity seeking groups or equity deserving groups, we're sovereignty seeking people. And that is a separate issue. That is a totally different relationship to the Canadian nation state than maybe other folks. So while I understand the necessity, I also see it. I also see the great possibility and potential to connect to anti-colonial movements happening in Indigenous communities the world over. And I see the power in numbers in terms of calling out, white supremacy and colonialism, in that connection, while still acknowledging the importance of the uniqueness of sovereignty-seeking efforts in the Canadian nation state. So for me, it's like, this double-edged sword, and for me, the possibility is in seeing those connections, because I like this conversation has produced so many fruitful connections about what's going on internationally, and the connecting points of how these things are related to, whether it's the Canadian nation state or the Canadian government or colonization. These are the conversations that need to happen in order to move us forward as differently located, Black and Brown and Indigenous peoples. In terms of what comes next, is making those connections and doing that sort of necessary work. And that's sort of like the hopeful future that I sort of envision as to where this work can go, and where it needs to go. Because as we know, in a globalized world, our governments are not operating just in the territories of Canada, right? They're operating internationally, transnationally, multi-sectorally. They're operating in cahoots with other white settler governments. And so we've got to also think on that level in order to really combat what's going on here. So just some of the thoughts.
Thanks so much for that, Cian, and also reminding us about how this work is being done within the ongoing conditions, right, of the surveillance and state violence against Black people, and particularly, like as Riley was also saying, that there are people within Indigenous communities, such as myself also, who also benefit from white privilege as well, and that we need to think about those differences and complexities and how they play out within our communities. Okay, does anybody else want to jump in and share any final reflections?
I can go next. I think what Cian said is very kind of flows into some things I want to share on this end. So this is I want to share this slide that I have just to visually explain some of the things we're dealing with here on this side, as far as multi-layers of imperialism happening here. Can you folks see this? Everyone can see that. So, I've shared a little bit about, the U.S. side, as far as what began in 1893, which was the military occupation supported by, the overthrowing of the Hawaiian Kingdom government by a few of the plantation owners and their corporations, with the help of the U.S. military. That was in 1893, the overthrowing of Queen Liliuokalani, and really was, although I would say a disruption of our sovereignty and not the end of our sovereignty, because that's the ongoing conversation we continue to have, is that we are still sovereign and we've been sovereign. It's just the fact that there's another entity in the way, trying to constantly take it from us. And it's for us, it's a re-knowing and relearning that what it does it mean to be sovereign, and continue to fight for it. So here on like the left side, this is like the United States government, and here below is the U.S. military that worked with these corporations right here, which the primary one that I'm going to be talking about is Alexander and Baldwin right here. They are the ones that formulated what we know today as the so-called state of Hawaii, including creating the laws through the legislature. They control the Supreme Court and the court system, as well as the enforcement of those laws that they created, such as through the Department of Land and Natural Resources. And below the Department of Land and Natural Resources, DLNR, is what's called CWRM, the Commission of Water Resource Management. If you look on this side, you'll see that Alexander and Baldwin's over here. So this is where my particular struggle in East Maui side comes in. On Maui, actually, Alexander and Baldwin is the corporation that I won't say owns the land, but the majority of the land, but controls it through their own fraudulent land claims that they've signed off documents, claimed that those were our ancestors, signing away our lands to them, or they say they bought it, or there's so many examples on Maui of things that don't quite make sense in their own claims to our lands. And it's really about opening up those inconsistencies that we find on their end. So Alexander and Baldwin and Mahipono together are the two corporations that own East Maui Irrigation. So they control the water. But again, because Alexander and Baldwin is part of controlling the state of Hawaii, because they own or they control most of the land, they're a political entity really. They're the real estate, so they funnel a lot of money into the state that they've created. Even though some of the laws, the state laws, were taken from the Hawaiian Kingdom laws that were already established, they just copy pasted them. Those laws aren't actually enforced. That's why we have issues with the water, because again, they control the state of Hawaii. That's why the Department of Land and Natural Resources doesn't actually enforce any of the water laws. And we constantly deal with excuses from the state. They'll tell, like in my own example of this past year, I've been told by the corporation itself, Mahipono, and their supervisors that, there aren't any diversions on my river, or there's only one diversion, and they didn't disclose a few other ones. When I went to the state agencies that are supposed to be in charge of the water and, saying how much water is supposed to be in the streams, these laws are supposed to be followed, the state agencies told me there wasn't a single diversion on my river, even though previously I had, email communications from the corporation themselves admitting to one. And so those are like the kinds of things where, like earlier I mentioned, like the documentation is very important, because that's the upper hand card sometimes with even the state. And so these are the entities that, control the water. And if you look higher up on Mahipono, it's controlled by Pomona Farming, which is a farming company in the Bay Area in California, and also the CPP, which Wahikea mentioned earlier. And so this is more, this is where the double layer of imperialism, as far as East Maui is concerned, we're dealing not only with the United States imperialism, but Canadian imperialism here. In other parts of the island, as well as on the other islands, this kind of mapping would look different because who is the other player controlling the lands and waters is different for each area. This just happens to be what it looks like for my region. And so this kind of all plays into NAFTA and these two countries, the United States and Canada, really being able to exploit land and water and controlling it, at least in Hawaii, through the military occupation backing them up, to create produce and food that in Hawaii doesn't make sense for those plants to be growing here. They're very much the same plants that throughout California is all produced, and those same plants that typically get shipped down to Mexico, and then we deal with indigenous Mexican folks having to they're displaced from their lands because this the agriculture that comes from California competes against them and forces them to migrate northward. And that's where I actually grew up in California, and I have many friends and colleagues that share those stories with me of their family's displacement because of Californian agricultural practices and NAFTA specifically. And so through the things that they shared with me as far as the Mexican side of knowledge, that helped me to really think through what's happening in Hawaii is very much connected into those as far, and then there's a part of Canada playing its part too. And so that's also what I mean by sharing knowledge is I don't think a lot of folks in Canada know this, for example. I've been lucky enough to have had the opportunity to be involved with a short film documentary that previously a lot of our stories here in East Maui hadn't been, they were very local and they weren't being pushed out into the global conversation. That's what pretty much throughout Hawaii we deal with, is that a lot of the knowledge as far as the occupation is concerned doesn't really reach masses outside as much as it could if we just have the platforms, right? Luckily, I had the opportunity with other family members in other parts of the islands to have that platform to share our stories on a global scale through Al Jazeera Plus, and I think after some of our stories actually went out globally, the state sort of responded and differently as far as actually, holding like Supreme Court rulings that these companies, like even their own water permits, weren't legal. There's been battles happening for years and years and years, and nothing really pulls through. Like Wahikea mentioned earlier with the breach, sharing that news article. One of the key points I remember reading was like that Mahipono, has been doing these reports, and that CPP is, as long as they do everything legally, their one goal is to maximize profit, for example. And then there's a line in that article that says that they didn't even mention anything in the reports. They didn't even mention our own rights as Kanaka Maoli and our water rights, and so they completely circumnavigate the very laws that basically CPP shouldn't even be operating with this, because it's already illegal, because they're breaking our own and violating our own rights here on Maui. And so these are some of the things that I think are important for folks in Canada to know, because that it helps to amplify our struggle and put greater pushback on the Canadian government that what it's doing here in Hawaii is illegal, and we're really fighting not only U.S. imperialism but also Canadian imperialism, at least on East Maui. And so yeah, that's where I'm at. It's really thinking through these things myself. Yeah. How do I end share screen? Oh. Right here. Okay. Yeah. Mahalo. Sorry, I was trying to figure out for.
Thanks so much, Kani Alihi. And I think what you've shared with us connects really well with some of the work that both Riley and May have been doing. And so I'm going to invite them to give the last words here. So we'll first go to May, and then we'll finish with Riley.
Yeah, now there's like so many things to thread, and just I'll start with thinking about Canada and how it's understood in different parts of the globe, and I'm thinking specifically in the Philippines as this benevolent place where Indigenous people do not exist. I had an opportunity to speak with and work with folks from the part of the Philippines that was affected by Typhoon Yolanda that was decimated. And yeah, we did a short presentation on my work, and yeah, they were just didn't appreciate, or was the first time hearing that Canada is a colonial formation, because their understanding of Canada is as an imperialist formation. Because of Canadian mining operations, and every kind of bits of news I get between the Philippines and Canada includes two things. One is labor migration, how Canada is really an active recruiter and has set up operation to recruit labor from the Philippines and to extract that labor. And the second one is, there's three: mining, of course, which I think everyone's pointed out so far. And the third one is military and police support. And for those mining extractive industries, RCMP routinely sends people to the Philippines. It's personnel to the Philippines for training, and the military routinely sends weaponry and helicopters and whatnot. So there's so many layers that your all folks are bringing together that's making me think, we have to think globally. At the same time as thinking globally, though, is I can't help but thinking of Ruthie Gilmore's work, and who's a Black abolitionist who talks about revolution happens in place because it happens with people whose lives need support, right? Who need to live, and relying on each other to change and transform ways of being is in those intimate spaces where we live together and work together and struggle together. So I think the question is, how do we have those world building, future making aspirations, orientations, while doing both at the same time? And I don't think that's impossible, because we're talking to people who are, as you've all pointed out, inherently global, right? We've just been made to think that we live in these nation states, and that's our, for myself and my community and my family, it's our nature, our relationship is only to this question of citizenship. So there's ways, right? Like our very beings are wrapped up in these global formations. So it's not impossible, but it does need to be in place, right? Specifically, all the things that were shared earlier about, the struggles on the front line and feeding each other. That's where I first saw that. It was in the Philippines. I went to a picket line of labor unionists, and I saw a vision of a future on the picket line where people are living and feeding each other, teaching each other, taking care of each other's kids and each other's futures on a picket line in which they live, right? They don't just go there 9 to 5. They really just try to shut down the factories for so those are things that I get inspired by, and I try to always remember in thinking about how do we do these, think about the work, being mindful of all those interconnections, but those internet connections are embodied. So how do we do that for each other, right? How do we nurture that in each other and seeing those connections? And I think everybody's already beautifully spoken to that. So I'll leave it to Riley.
Miigwech. That was so lovely. Oh, there's so many lovely things. And I have like a whole book of everybody's amazing thoughts. So I'm so excited to read that again. Yeah, I guess maybe to cap off, I've been really stuck on this idea lately that the future isn't just a vision, right? It's not just a dream, it's a practice. It's not there's a line in the sand that it's oh, and now we're in the future. It's something that we do every day and have to embody every day. Those idealized versions of what could be in order to actually make them come to fruition. And so that's where to go back to, also, we've talked a lot about what it means to stand with one another, what it means to help people reclaim those understandings of themselves and of our relationships with one another. That's all part of it. And to go back to love, though, I feel I had to remind myself how it was my very best friend. Her name is Masoma. She's the most interesting woman. She's a refugee from Nigeria, but she spent her whole life in Canada in Nunavut, living amongst Inuit. And so she has got the most incredible worldview. Anyways, I learned from her all the time. And she was saying to me, she was like, Riley, isn't it so awesome that when we sit together and we hang out and we have a beer and we're cracking jokes and we're laughing and just loving one another, that's us doing it. That's us, we're not just, on the picket line or fighting with one another, whatever. She's we are in love with each other. And that is us living those futures of what solidarity and all of those things look like. And I was yeah, right. And I think about that all the time when I get to share moments with queer folks and with Black and Brown and other Indigenous folks that those are us living those futures that we're practicing. And so, yeah, I just think that just to maybe expand the boundaries of what also solidarity looks like. I love this idea that yeah, it's us getting dinner together. It's us, going and doing all these things in addition to showing up for one another in our struggle. And so, yeah, and I think also the other part I'm thinking about in terms of if we're practicing the future, really looking inward, I want to go back to those critical conversations where yeah, there's just Indigenous people, for example, we're allowed to have disagreement amongst ourselves and amongst our nations. That's part of what makes people, alive and fruitful, but also we have to be sure we're not then recreating those same processes of oppression that brought us to this place in the first place, where I think so much about there's huge conversations about economic self-determination in Canada. And for a lot of Indigenous people, like that is also this belief of like, okay, then we'll just be the ones that are in control or profit off of resource extraction. And I'm like, we see how this is implicated in like way beyond just like your res, way beyond just your treaty lands, like, and how are we thinking critically enough about that? I don't necessarily think we are all the time. And so like, that's like an example again of like one of those conversations. So yeah, share a beer and have the critical conversations.
Thanks so much, Riley. And I couldn't help but have a big smile when I saw the little visitor come onto CN's screen. So that is also our future, the youth and children within our communities. But I just want to finish by saying, big miigwech to you all for your generosity and for the knowledge that you've shared today. My heart and my mind feels full from everything that everyone shared. And I wish we could all go out for dinner together and share a meal. Wahikea, Riley and I are going to go share some food, but we will definitely be missing Kani Ali'i, Sian, and May. But I'm confident that we will, that our paths will continue to cross and that hopefully we'll have more time to visit in person in the years to come. I'm just going to, and also before we close off, I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to view this conversation. And also a big thank you to the staff at Dechinta who are doing a lot of the behind the scenes work and who are putting a lot of care and energy into organizing the virtual portion of the NAISA conference, but also there's going to be 2 in-person regional portions for NAISA through Dechinta as well at Yellowknife and Whitehorse. So if any of you are in those regions, make sure to check out the events that are going on.